I just start off by thanking Aideen, the University and the Institute for the invite. It's my first time here and the welcome has been outstanding, so thank you very much. And how did I get to stand here? Well, when I was 4, my father was lumbered with me one afternoon. My father was a baker and he was making Russian cakes, or Battenbergs for those of you who don't know what a Russian cake is. Between me and him was a small mountain to a 4-year-old, which was, of course, marzipan. And I did what any self-respecting 4-year-old would do and begin to try and eat my way through the mountain of marzipan to get up towards my father. The abiding interest in food was born, and that has been my entire life's work. So, Brexit, minefield or new dawn? We don't know. Media is saturated with it. It's everywhere. This is the Labour issue. We'll come back to this one. This is where do we go in the UK on food and farming. We're at, in many senses, a T-junction in the UK. So for 43 years, we followed the European model. Whatever Europe said, we just got on with it and did it. The government now has to decide what is the agricultural framework for the United Kingdom, because if you're going to leave, Europe isn't going to do it for you anymore. And Pat quite rightly said, it may be cheap food, or it may not. It may be very supportive of farmers and move towards an economic return for farmers. So we currently operate in a system, as do most Western economies, where farmers are part supported by government to give them an effective living. The alternative to that is that we pay a market price for the product that gives them a living. To do that, we as a society have to look at 3 things in together. I like to talk about a 3-legged stool. And one leg is the price of food ex-farm. The second leg is environmental sustainability and all the things that farmers do for us on the environment. And the third leg is rural society. Average farm size in Northern Ireland is about 58 acres, and there is a price to that. But it maintains the look of our land, it maintains our family farm structure, and it maintains our rural society. So we have a set of things to balance off as a society: the price of food, the cost of maintaining our environment, and the cost of maintaining our rural society. It's not one border, it's actually 4. If you go to cross a border, you will have a regulatory barrier, which is tariffs. You will have a phytosanitary or veterinary, in most of our cases, border. And then you will have exactly the same 2 on the other side of the border because it's a different jurisdiction. If we take the minimum sampling rate, which is typically 5%, there is every chance that you could get hit on all 4 of those as a sample. You can imagine what the delays would be, and you can imagine what the problems that would cause. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between Agri-Food North and Agri-Food South. We are each other's largest customer. I work very closely with my colleague Paul Kelly, who runs an excellent organisation called Food and Drink Industry Ireland, and I also work very closely with my colleague in the UK, Ian Wright, who runs the Food and Drink Federation, the national trade body. So we need to understand the relationships between food within these islands. Approximately 4 to 5 billion goes east-west, and approximately 4 to 5 billion goes west-east. Or to put it slightly facetiously, cornflakes and baked beans go that way, beef and cheese goes that way, and it roughly balances out. And curiously enough, it's very similar north-south. as you rightly put up, the balance is about 750 million going in each direction. Oh. So we have within our relationships balance. And that's very important for us because we are not fundamentally in competition with each other. And there is actually very close agreement between the Irish food manufacturer representatives, the UK food manufacturer representatives, and ourselves, that we all actually want the same thing. And the same thing is, could we please keep things as close to where they are at the minute? So what are we going to see as consequences? Well, I think we're going to see a UK Board BIA, which I think is a huge endorsement of all Tara McCarthy's work, and I think the Irish should feel suitably proud of the work that Board BIA has done over the last 21 years. It has been a great enabler for Irish food. However, it's had a clear run because there used to be a UK organisation called Food from Britain. It was axed about 9 years ago, and there now is a movement to create a UK Board BIA. So Board BIA may have a competitor shortly. Whether it's got the same capacity, same skills, don't know. Okay, I mentioned our relationships within these islands. They're really very simple. Exactly. So how do we map Brexit onto this? Well, Brexit is really about three things. The first is Ireland and EU, which is pre-existing, and of course there is the supposition that it will not change in any shape or form going forward. I'm not so sure about that. The second is between United Kingdom and EU, and I think there's every likelihood that that's going to change very materially. And the third relationship is between these islands, Ireland and the UK and the EU. So we've got three sets of agreements that need to be sorted out simultaneously. And you've heard a lot of issues already flagged up by my excellent predecessors, all of which I agree with. Those are all very valid issues. But nevertheless, it's going to have to be done in these three circles. Our simple view would be, let's start with all three circles staying the way they are and begin to migrate them over a period of time, slowly, which is really about transition. We've publicly asked for 10 years transition because we think really that's what it's going to take. And just since you're all sitting and being very quiet, anybody in the room tell me how long it takes to make a sirloin steak? Oh gosh. 3 years. The dairy cycle is 8, birth to death. And the death bit is 10% of the total value of that system. So I think we need to think very carefully about how are we going to support farmers going forward who have to make very long-term decisions, as do processors. Food is number one in the UK. I'll not bore you with this, going through this slide, but it is not understood in Westminster that agri-food production in the UK is bigger than aerospace and car manufacturing put together. It's only beginning to sink in. I think in Ireland you have an excellent position where the Agriculture Minister, indeed supported by IFA, is very highly regarded, and in the political firmament, one could argue maybe the third most important person. I don't know whether people agree or not, but certainly when you go to the UK, the Agriculture Minister, I don't think would be perceived as the third most important minister. That's going to change. Okay, Northern Ireland. The blue dots are farms, the green dots are food processing. It's our biggest industry, exactly the same as ROI. and it's about 4.6 billion. We can't determine Brexit. It's political. It's not based on science, it's based on politics and negotiation. But hopefully, I can give you a quick whirlwind tour of what might happen and what we think. Okay, let's start with threats, since I think that's the spicier bit. There are options under WTO, but outside, we're stuck. And really, some of this is a reiteration of previous speaker, just put in a different way. And it's already been flagged up. We're joined at the hip. I would point out that there's even more joining at the hip than this simple stuff. By the way, the flour one is a really interesting one. There's no bread-making wheat grown on the island of Ireland, though as far as I can see has been. There are 3 flour mills on the island. The 2 bulk commercial flour mills are both in Belfast. So most of their output is actually coming south. The WTO tariff on flour is 65%. Game over overnight, and creates a huge problem for other Irish industries. But we haven't, and don't think any speaker has yet talked about transshipping. So Northern Ireland will send a lot of its goods through Dublin Port to the south of England. A lot of Irish food is actually shipped from Europe into UK, and then the loads are broken down and then forward shipped into Ireland, because that's the most cost-effective way to do it. So we have a lot of movement of goods backwards and forwards. And in fact, somebody flagged up this morning Bailey's Irish Cream, made in the United Kingdom in Mollusk, in Belfast. The cream may actually go across the border 5 times, because it may be northern milk going south to be turned into cream to go back up to be put into Bailey's, or it may be Irish milk going north to get turned into cream to go into Bailey's, and so on and so forth. And that is determined by time of year and supplies. So it ain't simple. I think we've got about 28% exposed to Europe directly. So from our point of view, it's huge. If we can't trade with Europe, we're going to lose the guts of a third. Nearly 1/5 of our entire private sector is in agri-food. A lot of people will talk about supply chain. It's a particular pet hate of mine, because supply chain implies one link hanging off another. That's not the reality of the situation. Farming, food processing, cold stores, packaging, haulage, animal feed, farming contractors, it's an ecosystem. The relationships are very complex, they're very intertwined, and I like to talk about the eating ecosystem, because I think it much better describes the reality of the situation. Okay, what are the tariffs like? Well, you can see the average net margin for food processing in Northern Ireland is about 2.7%, not my figures, the government's. And as you can see, all the tariffs are way beyond that, quite deliberately. Tariffs are designed to limit the movement of agri-food products. So people say tariffs will be a huge problem. Actually, in commercial terms, they won't, because they will be very simple. It's not commercial to do anymore. It won't be, yes, we could, in the case of, say, car manufacturing, where tariffs are typically 5%, you could maybe carry 5% on the cost of a vehicle. You certainly can't carry any of these tariffs on agri-food products across borders. I mentioned labour. We use about 50% non-UK labour. At peak times of the year, we're using 90%. We are already in severe problems on labour. The combination of the shift in currency and, if you like, the chill factor generated by some of the statements coming out of Westminster have meant that foreign nationals, A, are not coming in, and B, are going home quicker. And the combination of those two things is creating a shortage. I would say this, beyond my own sector, which is obviously agri-food, the other 2 sectors that are going to feel this first are hospitality and healthcare. because all those sectors use a lot of migrant labour and also would have big seasonal peaks, particularly Christmas and Easter. We've talked a wee bit about what might happen to prices. I'm not going to go through this in much detail. There's lots and lots of what if, and Rumsfeld has already been quoted. I'd point you to this document. So this is commissioned by the nations of the UK, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. It's using an internationally recognised model, very significant piece of work. And if we go to the Singapore solution, as it is called, let's just be a free trading nation and we'll not have tariffs, which is a quote from Liam Fox. This is what it would do to prices. Which, if you happen to be involved in producing any of these commodities, is not very nice. How would you like to lose 40% of your salary? Well, let's move on to the other side. The UK is not self-sufficient in food. In fact, it's got a £21 billion trade deficit in food. Now, some of that is things that we would really struggle to supply. Pineapples, red wine, etc. But the UK is not self-sufficient in red meat, or pork meat, or chicken, or dairy, or eggs. There is a huge opportunity for us and the Scotch and the Welsh and the English to increase self-sufficiency of supply. In fact, this is exactly the other side of the coin of the last speaker. Dairy in particular. You can see here the trade imbalances. But in order to do this and have this change, we are going to have to do a huge amount of investment. As has already been said, a very significant proportion of Northern Ireland milk is processed in ROI. If we were going to process that in NI, we're going to have to build factories to do it. And if any of you have been involved in commissioning factories, by the time you've done the environmental impact assessment, gone through regulatory control, planning permission, raised the capital, actually built the shed, got the workers and commissioned it, it isn't a quick process, typically 3 to 4 years. So, carcass balance. Nobody's mentioned carcass balance yet, and it's a great subject, and I felt I should. In the United Kingdom, the average consumption is 10 chicken breasts for every 7 legs. Well, that causes a bit of a problem because they don't come in that kind of ratio. So we can only supply 7 chicken breasts because we actually, if you think about it, how on earth are we going to supply the other 3? So our lack of success in exports has actually curtailed our ability to penetrate our own home market. So if we can get more export, and the irony in the chicken example is that the Asian markets value leg meat higher than breast meat. They actually put a premium on it. The UK has been very poor at gaining access to international markets or getting behind that. A big thrust for us is now, can we please fix that, which will allow us then to ramp up and actually do more in the UK market. In commodities like chicken, that's not bad news for ROI, but in commodities like beef and cheese, that would be more competition. And as I've mentioned, chicken and breast meat example. We've talked a lot about scenarios. There are a lot. And really, I have spent the last year in interminable meetings with both politicians, lobbyists, other fellows in industry and ladies trying to get to grips with what does this mean. And all I can tell you is the level of complexity has continuously increased. I don't know whether you found it the same, but those of us who have been in the industry a very long time, and I count my 34 years as a very long time, thought we knew something about it until we started getting into this. Just to unpack another layer of complexity for you, farmers are paid on Europa cattle grading. It's not actually in any agreement. So it's recently surfaced. That's another one that's going to have to be written up as a separate thing if there's going to be a parallel agreement. These are coming out of the woodwork, left, right, centre, everywhere at the minute. I'm not going to go through this. I'm sure you can get access to these slides afterwards if you want. We talked about the border. A frictionless border, by the way, is an oxymoron. I'm not aware of a frictionless border anywhere on the planet. Another interesting little bit of politics. Phytosanitary and sanitary is actually in strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement, specifically mentioned, which is why we've got very good cooperation north-south on agriculture, why we've got very good cooperation on diseases and controls, and that's not unreasonable since it's in both parts of the island interest to look after each other. And just while I'm talking about this bit, another interesting point, I think, is devolution in the United Kingdom was done while we were members of Europe. So, for example, whilst Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England all export beef and market beef actually separately, regulatory control for market access is national and is only done by DEFRA. But we have 4 separate departments of agriculture and 4 agriculture ministers. So there is another political landscape beginning to open up, which is, did we devolve the right things? The Food Standards Agency for the United Kingdom has already broken into 2 bits. Food Standards Scotland and everybody else. So there are, as I say, layers upon layers of this. Okay, the Cyprus solution, I think, may hold some hope for Northern Ireland. The Turkish bit of Cyprus is allowed to trade into the EU. It's got a little special derogation, and it may be a model to come up with something special for Northern Ireland to try and head off some of these issues. I'm not sure. I think it's a very obscure political solution, but it may be one that we can use. Another option might be to go for quotas. Quotas has the advantage of we can freeze things now, so everything stays as is. The disadvantage of quotas is we can't grow, we can't change, but it might minimize damage. And then, of course, we don't have a government at the minute because they're arguing about an Irish Language Act. And that's not helping our case. Now, we've recently produced guidance for our members, which is a confidential checklist of things that you need to think about around Brexit. It currently runs to 7 A4 pages and includes obscure things like your IT systems. Are they predicated in EU law or UK law? And what do you do in the case of you end up in a case? So just there is a panorama of issues. Now, I want to finish with a couple of things. Firstly, we've heard about hormone-treated beef, chlorine chicken. I had the privilege of giving the City Food Lecture earlier this year on behalf of Professor Chris Elliott, who's the man who wrote the Horsegate report. It's up on YouTube. If you search City Food Lecture 2017, it starts at 7 minutes in. Apart from the stunning presentation of it, which I actually gave because he couldn't do it, the lecture itself is worth listening to and covers and predicts some of the frictions that we're starting to get into. Theresa has said just today that Brexit will happen at precisely 2300 hours on Friday, the 29th of March, 2019. Therefore, we have 504 days to go. And I'll finish, finally, with a quote from Voltaire, the scientist. Before you attended this lecture, I'm sure you were confused about this subject. Having attended, I hope that you're still confused, but at a higher level.